This time on X-Men History, we're going to be talking about X-Men during the 70s. And this is a very interesting time period for the X-Men. It's a very interesting transition period for them. You know, from going to being the other, Marvel title to becoming a franchise, and we're going to be talking about how they got from one point to that. Now, just to go over briefly, the 70s is when, the time period that Vietnam came to an end, and as I stated earlier, it came to an end in 1975. It's a time period of awareness of nuclear activity, a time period of the women's liberation. We have rock and roll on the rise. It's the disco era, but it's also the time of oil crisis. We have the dawn of microwave ovens, VCRs, and it's also the era of mood rings, crystals, and lava lamps. We have the first video games we have Atari. We have early calculators. The Cold War was continuing, and in '73 we had Watergate and the whole thing with Nixon, and then we have President Carter, and various other things. Now, for X-Men, from issue 1 up to about 63, the comics continued. Also, Days of Future Past movie, it's tapping into the 70s and a little bit of X-Men during this time period. But anyways, from issue 1 to issue 63, as I talked in my previous video, we have this, interesting time period for X-Men, from the beginning of the classic Kirby Stan Lee era. Then we have the middle ground, and then during the end of the 60s we have the Roy Thomas and Neil Adams era that, as I talked about, had, interesting stories and was doing X-Men quite well, and well enough to even be considered to come back. Now, for the original run, we only have 3 issues that came out. Issue 64, we have the introduction of Sunfire, and for this story, it's just Roy Thomas on his own. And Sunfire is a Japanese mutant, who came about because of the, the bomb there, and his uncle is manipulating him to, cause, he got revenge. And then in issue 65, Neil Adams returns, and, we get Lorna Dane and Alex Summers coming back as Havoc. And then we also get the return of Charles Xavier, who proves it's the real deal by, casting his thought waves and, showing that, yes, indeed, I am the real professor. And this is probably one of the first instances of a character has died, but the dead person wasn't the actual real deal. It was actually an imposter or a duplicate or whatever, and the real person is actually alive the whole time. We'll see this again with 2 other significant, storylines and characters. This is one of the first, and it's, Xavier pulling the deal. As we talked about with the last video, Xavier died, and the mutants were, without him for a while, and it's revealed here that Xavier was preparing for a secret mission. But then the Changeling, who was with Factor 3, came along and, says he wants to redeem himself, and, he's going to take Xavier's place. He's dying of an illness. He's going to take Xavier's place. Xavier gives him some of his powers, while the real Xavier is going to work underground to fight prepare for an alien menace. Changeling in the form of Xavier leads the team, and he's the one that dies. And now the real professor has returned. All set to prepare for a alien invasion by this group of aliens that are prepared to take over. And the professor is leading everybody, joining everybody together, their thoughts, and is providing a sort of mental attack against these aliens. And, by joining them all together, he's able to, defeat them. But, Xavier is weakened by this. So, for the last issue 66, the X-Men, become entangled with the Hulk. They eventually, the professor gets cured. And, as the ending declares, they fought happily ever after. And, this was the last issue. This is when it got canceled. And, these first 3 issues were, during 1970, from January to March. And, for a while, that was it for X-Men. The cancellation of the title. And, but again, Roy Thomas and Neil Adams went out with a bang, I feel. And, made it to where X-Men could even be considered to come back. So, the X-Men went out on a high note. Then we get a time period when the X-Men are guest appearances in other comics. And, they're not the main focus, and we really have a lot to owe to Steve Englehart, who is doing his best to even have X-Men even considered, during this time period. And we have, X-Men appearances from 71, 72, 73, 74, and 75. And, again, it's just guest appearances during this time period. For Amazing Spider-Man issue 92, we get Iceman popping up. As us 80s kids know, that Spider-Man, Iceman, and Firestar were, Spider-Man and his amazing friends. And, then for Hulk issue 150, we get Lorna Dane and Havoc, who make an appearance. And more famously, for Amazing Adventures, issue 11 and onwards, we have a series with Beast. Hank McCoy, who is going off on his own solo adventures. But this is where we get the start of the furry Beast. Before earlier, he had the more acrobatic look, but here he has the bestial look. And this is due to experimentation and whatnot, as we see with the First Class movie. This is depicting that, where through experimentation, he is now forever changed, looking like the, furry Beast. And, he's going off in his own solo adventures, after he's left the X-Men. And, sometimes he meets other characters, such as Iron Man, as we see here. And, he, is having more adventures on his own. But he's wearing a disguise at times. But he's still underneath the more monstrous figure. And, he's just having these very interesting solo adventures on his own, sometimes meeting up with old foes, such as the Brotherhood, and other characters. He comes across various villains and whatnot. Then, he just has various solo adventures on his own. He even meets up with... Hang on 1 second. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yes, he meets up with Juggernaut and battles him. Then we also get, for Incredible Hulk 161, Beast again, shown here. We also get, an reappearance of Mimic, who was an early, semi-X-Man. And, so we just, for these 70s, we get, just guest appearances. Also, going from, various annuals and king sizes, we get reprints. We get this king size annual with reprints. And then issue 67, we get a reprint story. And throughout various issues, we get, other reprints. And this continues on up to issue 93, of reprint issues. Old stories that were around during the 60s reprinted again, during the 70s. So we see that, their earlier stories are being retold in these new reissues. The title progression is from issue 67 to issue 93, as if this comic's still going on, but it's just still the reprint era. Then, we get some other further guest appearances. For one, we get Avengers, where Magneto returns. And both the Avengers and, the X-Men pop up fighting him. And, for a whole comic, we get Juggernaut. And, for a Captain America comic, we have Banshee popping up, who was a one-time foe under control of Factor 3, then a temporary ally of the X-Men, and, the X-Men return for other Captain America and the Falcon issues. Then we have, let's see, Marvel Team Up issue 23. We have Iceman and, Human Torch, where Human Torch finds this ice villain, and he thinks Bobby Drake, the Iceman, caused some sort of crime, but it was actually some other ice character. And Human Torch confronts Bobby, and then, the original X-Men pop up, saying that the Professor were about to send them on a secret mission, which involved Bobby, and Bobby had just left. And Human Torch sees, well, since Bobby was busy, he couldn't have committed the crime. But again, we have this idea that the X-Men are about to go on the secret mission. We don't know what the secret mission is at this moment, but, we know it's a secret mission. So, Human Torch and Iceman team up together, and they fight the ice villain. Then we get Defenders issue 15, where we get, but first, a return of Professor Xavier. Can't really entirely see it, but just about. And he assists the Defenders because Magneto is back. And Magneto is facing the Defenders. He's with his traditional Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But he's resurrecting, or actually creating, Alpha, the ultimate mutants, and he wants this being to serve him and, defeat his foes. And that Alpha appears in issue 16 of Defenders. But Alpha turns out to have his own willpower, and he goes on his own. And in point of fact, Alpha turns Magneto and his, the others into babies. And Professor X is going to take these infants, which is going to be significant later on. Then we get in issue 180 of Incredible Hulk. At first, it's just a cameo of an important mutant that's gonna, resonate through for the rest of X-Men history. That is Wolverine. Here he just pops up in the end portion, but for issue 181, we get a full-on appearance of Wolverine, and this is, his beginning in comics. Wolverine created by Len Wein, and at this point, he's working for Department H in Canada. He has the claws. It's not indicated whether or not the claws can retract, but he has his more, distinct appearance, which will change later on. And, we don't know much about Wolverine, and this is typical in comics. We're introduced to character, but we don't know a lot of his backstory. And it's only through later years we find out more about him. And this is something that's going to play a lot of importance throughout characters for the future of X-Men. That we are shown this character, but, we don't know much about him until later on. So we get Hulk and Wolverine, becoming entangled with each other. And Hulk, pretty much defeats Wolverine, even though Wolverine was willing to stand up to him. Then for Gigantic Fantastic Four, issue 4, we have the introduction of Multiple Man. And we get an appearance with, Professor Xavier, who helps the Fantastic Four to fight Multiple Man. Professor even mentions that how the regular X-Men are off on a secret mission. Again, we don't know what the secret mission is at this moment. And Xavier, helps defeat Multiple Man, and he's going to take Multiple Man in. And then we get appearance of Beast in the team up with Spider-Man. And again, we just have these guest appearances and reprints, reprints of older stories, from 67 to 93. So, even though, X-Men was canceled and they had this high note, due to, Steve Englehart, they're still being brought into the consciousness of the readers, through these guest appearances and solo appearances and whatnot. And, so the X-Men are still, they're kind of in the background of these throughout the 70s, but they're still present. Then we get a very significant, reappearance of the X-Men. And before I go on to this, let me just state, I'm dealing with the history kind of as it happened. And I'm going to, ignore retcons for the present. I'm just going to deal with the history as it progressed. The retcons are what, again, came later on, trying to redo or rewrite the previous history. We're just going to deal with things as they happen. Now, we get in 1975 Giant Size X-Men issue 1, which is the first return of the X-Men as a solo team, not as a guest appearance, not as reprints, a complete return with them on their own, without any other heroes. And here we have Len Wein returning as a writer for Giant Size X-Men, and this is, as you see, Essentials. This is all black and white, and we're presented a whole new team. We get a more diverse team. For one thing, we get Storm, because in the 70s we get various African American heroes. For one thing, we get Luke Cage, who was the first African American superhero to have his own comic book. And, there's been various African American or, African superheroes in comics, such as Black Panther, who comes from Wakanda, a fictional country in Africa. And, we get very prominent African, American or African, characters who play a major part in the Marvel Universe. And Storm is no exception to this rule. She's the first African or black X-Men. Then we get Colossus, the Russian X-Men. We get Nightcrawler, who's German and, has the devilish appearance. We also get Wolverine with his more updated look, and, so we get a new diverse team, the all-new X-Men. We start out with the introduction of Nightcrawler and Professor Xavier recruiting him. Then right after the bat, Xavier goes to Department H and recruits Wolverine. Sooner after that, he finds Banshee and recruits him. Then we meet Storm, who is a goddess, and because she can affect the weather, and the African tribe worships her as a goddess. We also get Colossus, who lives in Russia at the time, and saving his sister from a tractor. And we also get Sunfire popping up and recruited. And the professor is gathering these new mutants, and he's wondering, if they can, stand up for the task he has at hand. His last recruit is Thunderbird, who's Native American. And, Xavier gathers these new mutants and recruits them to be his X-Men. And Colossus appears with his now more updated look. And Colossus describes how the original X-Men had gone off on a mission. Cerebro has detected this massive mutant power, and the original X-Men go to find out what it is, and they fail in this mission. The only one to come back is Colossus. So Xavier wants this new team to go and rescue the old team. And, Sunfire is at first reluctant, but he joins them. And in teams, they go off and explore this strange island, which is almost alive. They find the original X-Men who are imprisoned, and, being, as if sapped of their powers and their energy. And in fact, the island, Krakoa, is a living island. Now, again, we're going to ignore a later retcon because, as I said, We're only dealing with the comics as they progress, as they happen. And in this issue, Krakoa was created by, nuclear experimentation. He's a living island. He's been using his energies to stop the X-Men. He's feeding off the X-Men and their powers. He uses Cyclops to gather more food for him. And all the X-Men work together and expel, Krakoa out into space. And as they, are leaving, Angel wonders, what are they going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, we're going to soon find out. So that was Giant Size issue 1 in 1975. Again, a major solo appearance of the X-Men. There was going to be a Giant Size issue 2. Len Wein, the main writer, that actually became issue 94 and 95 of X-Men. And, so after the 66 issues, then the reprints, and then the guest appearances, we have the X-Men picking up where they left off. The all-new X-Men. And these two issues I remember distinctly at the time period, my cousin having both of these. So Len Wein, the main writer, and he's working with Chris Claremont, who's going to be significant, as we all know, and as I'll talk about in a few minutes. And, it's what was supposed to be Giant Size issue 2. The Xavier and all the mutants, and they're all deciding what to do. Sunfire, leaves right off the bat and says, I'm done with you guys, goodbye, don't call me. And Banshee decides to stay on, but the original X-Men, decide to pull out. They're done. So, Bobby, Hank, Angel, and Alex Summers, Lorna Dane, and Jean leave. And this is the way Len Wein intended it. Claremont they're going to make a change here, as we'll see. And Cyclops is the only original member to stay. All the other original team has left. They decide, we're adults now. We started out as teenagers. We need to find our own way now. But Cyclops, because he can't control his power, says, I have to stay. I have nowhere else for me. So Cyclops becomes the leader of the New Mutants, the new X-Men here. And, he begins training them in the Danger Room, and for weeks and, a month or so, he forges them into a team, although, Thunderbird is, very angsty and doesn't like Cyclops' authority. And, they become entangled with a villain who appeared in earlier X-Men. And he has his, group of, henchmen here. So we get Count Nefar returning. And, he's... Now, he has his new associates here. And, through his mega science, he's created, these more animal-like beings to serve him. And he's taking over Mount Valhalla, And, so he's taking over this major military base, and the X-Men go to stop him. And while they're fighting him, Thunderbird is trying to capture the Count as he's escaping on his plane here, nonetheless. And, the plane explodes and Thunderbird dies. This is the first death of a team member that we have in comics. And unlike, Xavier or later on, this death is, pretty much final. Thunderbird stays dead. And, so that's it for Thunderbird. And, Cyclops is like, well, that comes with the uniform. And then after these two issues, which again were supposed to be Giant Size issue 2, mainly written by Len Wein, with Chris Claremont as co-plotter, then we get issue 96. And this is a significant issue. This is the first solo Chris Claremont story. And as any true X-Men fan knows, it's Claremont that for many years throughout the 70s, 80s, and early 90s is, the main story writer of the X-Men. For so many years he has presented, a large bulk of the X-Men history, as we're about to talk about. That period ended with the new second volume X-Men in 91. But from, 75 to 91, Claremont was the main writer, the main creator of the X-Men books. And as we're going to see here, he provides so much rich history. And it's, again, just as, Roy Thomas, Neil Adams made X-Men interesting enough to be grand a return from cancellation. Steve Englehart keeping the X-Men still in the consciousness via guest appearances. Len Wein has the Giant Size with the solo team, but as Claremont, with this long run of writing history, is presenting us with a fantastic and epic time period for X-Men. That is, we have, other periods with the X-Men are, important, but this is the main, their greatest moment here. So anyways, with issue 96, we have Claremont's beginning. And it's just a standard issue where, X-Men fight a demon. And, Xavier is still out of sorts. We get the introduction of Moira McTaggart, who is, at this time is appearing as a nursemaid. Not a nursemaid, a maid. We also get, a tease of a character named Stephen Lang. And this is also a, major Claremont staple. That he will introduce something for an earlier comic, and then that what he showed earlier only pays off for a later comic. So we just get a guest appearance of Stephen Lang here as the X-Men fight this demon character. Then for issue 97, we have a return of Alex Summers and, as Havoc, and then Lorna Dane in now her new persona as Polaris, and they're being controlled by Eric the Red. And this is the time period when Xavier is having visions of a massive space battle, and, of a being escaping this space battle, but he doesn't know who this is. He's being kind of driven over the edge by this. And Eric the Red is leading Havoc and Polaris to try and kill Xavier. And, so the X-Men stop them, and the two brothers fight each other. And, Xavier, is going off on vacation, and, Havoc, escapes. He's still under control, and Scott sees that, he's going to have to fight him next time. all while Stephen Lang is watching and another figure is watching. Then, for issue 98, we get the return of the Sentinels. And they're looking pretty much as, Neil Adams depicted them here. As massive beings. We also get Jean Grey popping up for an appearance. As we see, Chris Claremont was very quick to bring her back. She was a minor character for the 60s, more as, a companion, and that's typical of those time periods. But as we're going to see here, going on with the women's liberation, Jean Grey is going to become a significant character for the X-Men comics. So we have the Sentinels who take off Jean and Scott, and, Stephen Lang is holding them hostage. And the X-Men have to go into space to, save them. And, all while, there's various, riots who are upset about, people are upset about mutants, and all due to the return of the Sentinels. And the X-Men fight the Mega Sentinels, or Sentinels who are looking like the original X-Men team, and they fight for issue 100, the 100th issue of X-Men. A very significant issue. So, the X-Men defeat Stephen Lang, and they're escaping in their shuttle. But the shuttle is going to run across solar flares, and there's untold massive amount of radiation here from the solar flares. Someone has to get them home, while the other X-Men, are safe in their, containment unit or whatever. And Jean Grey is the one who pilots the ship, and she's being bombarded with the radiation from the solar flares. Again, things are going to be changed here, but for the moment, let's just ignore what's going to be retconned later. Let's just deal with what happens in this story. Jean Grey in the solar flare being bombarded with massive amount of radiation. We don't know yet what's going to happen to her. But for issue 101, we get the appearance of Jean Grey as Phoenix. After being bombarded with the solar flares, the ship crashes, and, Jean Grey, what appears to be Jean Grey, pops up out of the water, declaring himself as Phoenix. And it seems to be, at this moment, that as a result of the solar flares, Jean Grey is now Phoenix. Again, this is going to be retconned and changed later. But let's just deal again what happens here at the moment. Which seems to be, due to the solar flare radiation, Jean Grey, a now powerful mutant. With powerful, great powers. She's out of it for a little bit. She, in a coma for a little bit, while the X-Men go off to Ireland, and they become entangled with Black Tom Cassidy and Juggernaut, who Black Tom's a relative of Banshee. And we discover that Aurora is claustrophobic. She can't take confined spaces. Being a weather being, she likes the open air. She cannot stand being in confined spaces. And, we find in flashbacks that Black Tom and Juggernaut were recruited by, Eric the Red. And the X-Men are saved by leprechaun beings and fairy beings who live underneath the castle. And we have Nightcrawler, his first ability to fade into the shadows, Then, for issue 101, we have the reappearance of Magneto. Eric the Red goes to the baby Magneto and, ages him. He makes him an adult again. And now it's the first introduction of the all-new X-Men fighting the now resurrected Magneto. The original team fought Magneto in the original comic. Now the new team is fighting him. Now, at this time, Magneto is still kind of the classic comic book villain. Here in this comic, he just wants to defeat the X-Men. And he believes he does. He believes he has beaten them in a fight. What actually happens is, Cyclops sees that this is all, just a ruse to delay them. Because the person really in danger is Xavier. Because, Eric the Red wants to go after Xavier. So Colossus wants to go back. And, so Eric the Red recruits Firelord. And, he wants to kill Xavier just as we get the introduction of Lilandra, the person that Xavier has been seeing in his visions and his dreams. And we find that Eric the Red wants to kill Xavier because of his psychic connection to Lilandra. Kill him before she gets to him. And, so the X-Men are captured by Eric the Red along with Lilandra and taken into a portal. And while Xavier is in the next issue, while Xavier is mourning their departure, he's flashing back to thinking when the X-Men are in the trading room session, and it appears that they are fighting the original team of X-Men. But it turns out this team is all fake. They're psychic projections of Xavier's dark side. And this is the first introduction of Xavier's dark side. So, Xavier is flashing back to these events. So that happens. And then in issue 107, the X-Men find themselves on an alien world, and they find themselves against Emperor Decan, who's the brother of Lilandra. And then they fight his Imperial Guard, which are very much in tone with, the Legion of Superheroes. In fact, we have a character that changes and looks a little bit like Chameleon Boy from Legion of Superheroes. And, at this time, Dave Cockrum is working with Claremont. And, in fact, some things that Cockrum wanted to present earlier on, he's presenting here in X-Men. And then the X-Men fight the Imperial Guard. They're joined by the Starjammers, who's led by Corsair. And Jean Grey, in point of fact, finds out that Corsair is very significant to Scott Summers, as we're about to see. While Decan is activating what's called the Omicron Crystal, which is a very powerful thing and could, in fact, cause the end of the universe itself. And the X-Men go into the crystal to try and stop it from, destroying everything. But it's through the power of Jean Grey as Phoenix that the Omicron Crystal is stopped. And this is the very first instance we see of just how powerful Jean Grey is at this moment as Phoenix. That she has this cosmic power that can stop this cosmic, gem and stop it from destroying everything. She heals everything. So we get a hint here just how powerful Jean Grey is here right now. For issue 109, we have, Weapon Alpha, which is from Department H. And this is the first inklings of a Canadian group of mutants that Wolverine once was a group of. And then we get, another villain who pops up. But for issue 111, we have a return of Beast, who finds that the X-Men are all working at a circus. But the X-Men are, in point of fact, under the control of another mutant. That is Mesmero, who appeared in the 60s. And just as the X-Men regain their true identities, they're about to fight Mesmero, but find Mesmero's unconscious, and they're faced with Magneto again. And then we get a very important storyline, starting with issue 112, where Magneto really defeats the X-Men group, and he imprisons them, and he's has them all captured, and he's really at the height of his powers, and he's really going off here and taking down various bases and whatnot, and he seems victorious here with all the X-Men in prison. But the X-Men free themselves. They're being kept in captivity in an active volcano. While the volcano is going off, Magneto escapes, and some of the X-Men seem to be in the explosion. Only Beast and Jean come out. And, Beast and Jean almost seem to freeze to death. And they go back, and it seems like the other X-Men are dead. But in point of fact, they go back to the Savage Land, which is, an underground world. And they come across Kazar, and in point of fact, that they meet again Sauron, who was a Roy Thomas figure, and they fight him a little bit. But in point of fact, the main villain that they're fighting is a very powerful being who, let's see, what's his name? Garrock. A sort of Earth being, alien being, who, is going to take over the Savage Land, but the X-Men stop him. And when they leave the Savage Land, they end up in Japan to once again meet up with, Sunfire, and they defeat a villain who's going to sink Japan. Just before, in issue 117, we have a flashback of Xavier remembering his early days. How he was in a relationship with Moira, and how he goes off to war, but she leaves him, and he's on his own for a while. He goes to Cairo, meets a young Storm, and he meets Farouk, who he has a psychic duel with, and defeats him on the astral plane. This is the first evil mutant he's faced, and sees that he needs to defeat. Now in Japan, Wolverine meets for the first time a very important character, Mariko, who's going to be very important to his life, as we'll see. Now, Banshee, in order to stop the sinking of Japan, has to use his power to the utmost. and you know, he really strains himself. And you know, for a long time, he's kind of out of it, and he actually thinks of leaving the X-Men. Then next up, for issues 120 and 21, we get the full-on appearance of Alpha Flight, which is the Canadian Mutants, and they want to get, you know, Wolverine to come back. You know, so this is the first time, you know, we get them propping up, and their full team is created by Chris Claremont and John Byrne. And they're a very important team. Now, this time, you know, Wolverine's a very mysterious character. We don't know a lot about him. You know, we, you know, only find out when the new X-Men meet the Sentinels that his claws can retract. You know, during that Christmas storyline, we see him without his, you know, cowl for the first time. So again, we're learning bits and pieces here. And this is another instance of learning just a little bit about him. You know, not a full story yet, but a little bit about him. So the X-Men defeat Alpha Flight. Jean Grey's on her own for a while, and she's coming up against a man calling himself Jason Wyngarde, who's more than he seems to be. And he seems to be influencing her. The X-Men, in the meantime, come against Arcade, who is a Spider-Man villain. And Colossus is manipulated, by him, and, you know, forced to play his games. And for annual number 3, the first 2 annuals were reprints. This is the first solo story, new story. And the X-Men meet Archon, who wants Storm to help him out on his world. For the next storyline, starting with issue 125, we have the start of how, again, Jean Grey is very powerful here, and, you know, we're not sure the limits of her powers, whether her powers can be controlled or not. You know, Moira is testing her and is actually quite worried about her. And, you know, the X-Men are preparing to, they're training during this time period while Magneto is on his asteroid, and we get a glimpse of an image of his wife. And, you know, this is just a small taste of Magneto's backstory. And Chris Claremont is the first to really explore this backstory. Again, it's just a taste here. You know, meantime, while Jean Grey is being, you know, influenced by Wyngarde, for the next issue with 126, we have a very important storyline in that the X-Men, you know, go to Ireland. They meet up with Multiple Man and Havoc, who Havoc is now reformed and he's no longer controlled by Eric the Red. And this is when we get, you know, we find out more about Moira, and we find that her son is Proteus, a mutant who takes over other people and lives on them, you know, and he's taking them over, and the X-Men fight him. It's a very significant storyline. And Colossus, because he's made of metal, is the only being that Proteus cannot take over, and Proteus, is killed in an attempt to take over Colossus. So, from issue 94 to 128, we have the beginnings here. 70s mutants. We haven't even gotten to the major storyline, because that's going to come in 1980. The very famous, Dark Phoenix saga, which, again, is going to start with 129, but that's in 1980s. So the 70s end with the Proteus storyline, pretty much. But we get here the beginning of the all-new X-Men, and just the beginning here of also interesting storylines, interesting characters, and very significant characters. And Jean Grey is very powerful here. We have a fear, a concern of her powers, and but we don't have yet the darker side of her powers. We're going to get that next time. We just get the hints. So as, I was saying, the original, in the beginning of the 70s, we have the original X-Men comic coming to an end with 3 issues. From, issue 64, 5, and 6. 3 issues of their end run. Just coming off of the very popular, or famous, Neil Adams, Roy Thomas run. And, again, interesting enough to warrant reappearances. Then we get the time period of the cameos and the reprints and the guest appearances and Beast changing and the first appearance of Wolverine throughout the mid-70s. Then from 75 to 79, we have all new X-Men, new storylines, the beginning of Claremont's run, the very significant storylines that are leading up to something really big here. And this is, again, when the X-Men become really popular and very interesting to the public consciousness. And, it's the beginning of the major franchise. So, that's, mainly what I wanted to talk about. And as, I was saying, this is a very interesting transition period for the X-Men. For the 60s, they were the other Marvel title. They were not popular. They had the classic introduction. They had the weird middle ground. Then, ending of a important time period. Then the cancellation. Then for the 70s, the end of the original, the guest appearances. Then the beginning of something significant and something very important to X-Men history. And, it's a wonderful, weird time period for them. For, the 80s and the 90s, the X-Men are a major Marvel title. For the 60s, they weren't. They were kind of the other title, and leading up to cancellation. For the 70s, it's a transition from one moment to the other, with little bits in between, but the beginning of something important. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about, and hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Thank you.